Purposes of the story I'm going to tell, you can call me Walt. I've been with the park rangers for about 17 years now. This story takes place about 10 years into my career. I want to stress that although this was a pretty scary experience, it has not changed my view on my job. I absolutely love my job in the outdoors. I work in a park in Kentucky. As I'm still working, I'd like to keep my job and identity safe. Mostly though, due to the strange circumstances of my story, I'd rather not have my peers grief me over this or scare anyone away from visiting our beautiful parks up here in Kentucky. Anyway, the park I speak of is a decent size and most of my job is pretty much just normal affairs. There is nothing quite like being out in nature, and there has always been a certain freedom to working in the outdoors with animals roaming. I love my job, and while the events of this story don't take place while on the job, they do take place in a park I work at. We were coming up on the weekend, and being it was gonna be a 3-day weekend for me, I was taking some extra time off to have a little mini vacation. I decided I would spend it camping in the woods around the area. A final important note before I get too much deeper into the story, I've been camping, alone, for most of my life. I know the woods and forests both from camping and from my job. Like the back of my hand, honestly. I don't spook easily and I'm a very level-headed guy. Anyway, I take off Friday through Sunday, so I can come back Monday and take over for another ranger who is going to spend the next week off for a wedding. Fast forward to Friday night. I make my way pretty deep into the forest and prepare to set up my camp for the night. This isn't unusual, as knowing the area quite well, I like to keep as far from civilization as possible. The first night goes off without a hitch. I'm able to relax and slowly drift to sleep. The relaxing sounds of nature, a soothing and natural white noise machine of sorts. It was around 4:30 Saturday morning when I woke up to a strange feeling. I'm not sure how to describe this feeling, but the closest I think I can get to is to say I felt panicked. This wasn't anxiety though, as I have no history of such and it isn't something that runs in my family. No, it was a strange and overwhelming need to move from where I was at. It was almost oppressive. I got up and packed my stuff and moved deeper into the woods. The further I got away from the spot, the closer the sun came to rising, the more I felt relaxed. I spent much of Saturday relaxed and had all but forgotten that morning by the time night rolled around again. This was the night I can't explain at all. It was around 7 in the evening, and I had decided I would park it for the night and just chill till I drifted off. I listened to the sounds of nature once again. This lasted for about an hour when suddenly things fell quiet. The eerie sorts. I started to get that feeling again. This time, however, I opened my eyes to see something I can't explain. They were lights. I'm not talking from a campfire or anything like that. I was far enough away from civilization, it wouldn't be a normal light source either. There's no light pollution here. These lights weren't super bright. They were actually luminescent and colorful. Many of them had red and blue hues to them. I watched the lights off in the distance for a time before they faded. One of the strangest things about this is when the strange lights faded, the sounds of nature returned, and the feeling of unease was no more. I couldn't sleep after this, so I kinda just sat up and debated heading back. The problem was, that'd take me quite a while, as I was a great deal away from where I parked before venturing into the forest. It wouldn't be safe to travel too far at night, and so I'd figured I'd just try to relax and enjoy the solidarity of the woods. It was about 11 p.m. when I got that uneasy feeling again. Nature fell silent once more, and I saw these lights appear again. This time, they were much closer, and while they still weren't super bright, I was close enough to see that they seemed to materialize out of nowhere. This threw me, and made me simultaneously more uneasy, and yet somewhat drawn in. What could be making these lights? They were materializing out of thin air, and they weren't coming from the moon or some other source. It seemed as though they didn't have a source, and I was quite perplexed as to their origins, honestly. After 10 to 15 minutes, the lights vanished as quickly as they had appeared, and just like that, I could hear the sounds of nature around me once again. I stayed awake for a time after that, and the last time I looked at my watch was 2 in the morning. This was also the last time I saw the lights. See, the thing is, I'd moved deeper into the forest, after the second sighting had settled down again, at about 1 in the morning, and an hour later I saw these lights again. Everything had fallen silent and they appeared in the distance. This was when I looked at my watch and saw that it was 2 in the morning. That was about all the time I had to do anything though, as the lights quickly made their way toward me. I freaked out, and I was about to get up and run when they enveloped me. The strangest thing about it is, I don't remember anything after that. I awoke the next morning at about 9 a.m. in my truck. It is very important that you understand I don't drink, I don't do drugs, I have no mental condition to speak of. The strange events of what happened are very real, and to this day I will never forget them. I can't explain how I lost 7 hours or even more, strangely how I wound up miles away from where I had even been. I don't remember passing out, and I have no idea what happened after the light reached me. I have no explanation for the lights. I'm still perplexed to this day. If you have even the slightest idea of what I may have seen, I'm all ears. It was easily the strangest thing I've experienced in my lifetime, and I'm thankful that I'll never experience anything like it again. Hopefully. One final thing to note though, is there didn't appear to be any sort of ship or flying object to these lights, so I don't think it was a UFO in the traditional sense, which I'm guessing is likely to be what most people will think of. Also, I've been camping out in the same area since and I've never seen those lights again. You can call me M. I used to work for the park rangers and I worked in quite a few parks in Montana. They are all very beautiful and quite large. What happened to me isn't common, so please don't be deterred by my story. Montana is a beautiful state with many wonderful parks. During my time as a park ranger, I was blessed with a 20-year career full of great times and beautiful sights. All that said, the scariest moment of my career was hands down what happened to me on a day that seemed like it was going to be like any other day. I was patrolling around Glacier National Park, and things were going like any other day. Things started off nicely with some light cleanup and a fresh cup of coffee. I was feeling chipper as it was almost the weekend and I was going to be off for once. It was as I was out patrolling that things went sideways. I heard what I believed to be a mountain lion. Now, this wasn't too much of a problem except for the fact that I was in an area closer to people. There are many sites around this massive and beautiful park, and plenty of them are areas far away from the general populace. That said, it becomes a problem when some of these wild animals start trekking in areas where people frequent. Thinking I'd best check around, I began my search. We love and respect wildlife, but we also respect the safety of people in and around the parks we patrol. The best case scenario for all is to be able to avoid injury to both wildlife and people. I took pride in my job, obviously, and part of the pride came with keeping the area livable for both nature and humans. Anyway, as I continued my search, I eventually did find mountain lion tracks. It had taken a while, but it was still too close for comfort to the area. I radioed in that there was possibly a mountain lion in the area, and told them where I was at before continuing my search. I kept up my search, checking in from time to time until I was far enough away from people to feel comfortable that the mountain lion wasn't too close anymore. I hadn't found the animal yet, and the tracks had ended, as I got into a more grassy area. Cautious but still comfortable in the fact that the animal was now sufficiently away from people, I radioed in to keep an eye out, but that I believed the animal had wandered farther away. I searched for a bit longer just to be sure before I finally decided I'd searched enough. Lunchtime was approaching fast and I felt very hungry after all my walking. I decided to turn back and head back to the station when out of nowhere I felt something hit me from behind and claw me in the back. I fell over and tried to scramble for my gun. I turned in time to get hit again and lost my weapon before jumping and running. I was going to try to radio in when I realized my radio had broken when I was knocked to the ground. It was at this point I found myself in panic, but as my senses came back to me again, I remembered that in the case of most mountain lion sightings, you should stand your ground and make yourself seem a threat. I thought to myself, how well and good that concept is, except for when one attacks you out of nowhere. I was standing now and surveying my surroundings. I could tell I was bleeding somewhat, but it seemed as though my injuries weren't deep, from what I could tell from it being on my back. Guessing I had been grazed more than anything, and the brunt of the attack had more from the surprise and also shoved to the ground, I looked around closely. The mountain lion had disappeared, but I couldn't take the feeling that I was being watched. Perhaps it was my paranoia at the time or the shock of the attack, but I couldn't get rid of the thing, or that feeling. I cautiously looked for my sidearm, but I couldn't find it. Being unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I headed as fast as I could toward the main station. At this point, I was quite a ways away, and was terrified that this thing was going to attack me again. I went as fast as I could. Move, my back still burning with pain from the initial attack. As I was starting to think maybe I'd be okay, I heard the distinct sound of a mountain lion crying out from somewhere behind me. I booked it and ran faster, now only glancing back from time to time to see if I was about to be jumped again. I could hear the mountain lion, but I couldn't see it anywhere. I continued running until I could run no longer. I took a breather and my eyes darted around the area as I scanned the area. I still hadn't shaken that feeling that I was being watched. I had to calm myself, however, as panicking was only making me more exhausted, and was making it harder to breathe on top of my running all over the place. I had just about gotten my breath back when I saw the mountain lion slowly stalk out. It looked ready to pounce again, and I felt myself starting to panic. I knew I had to keep my wits about me though, and this time, being the mountain lion wasn't blindsiding me, I tried to stand my ground. I gave the deepest glare I could give and puffed myself up before letting out the loudest shout I could muster. The mountain lion seemed like it was mulling its options over, and in the longest probably few seconds that it felt like an eternity, I stared this thing down. Holding my breath and on edge, I watched as the mountain lion let out a short roar before turning and slowly stalking away. The moment the thing was out of sight, I felt myself uncontrollably shaking. I was more scared than I've ever been in my life, and I felt weak from panic. I knew I couldn't stick around, however, and so I turned and tried to go as fast as my shaking legs would take me. I eventually made it back to the station, and it was then I was treated and gave my report about what had happened. As it turned out, I was right about my wounds. They weren't life-threatening or deep. The bulk of the pain came from bruising caused both times I was hit by the mountain lion. The panic and trauma stuck with me for the longest time, and I was given a few weeks off to recollect myself. I'm still wary anytime I hear a mountain lion, but the trauma has lessened a great deal over the years, and I still loved every moment of the remainder of my 20-year career with the park rangers. I shared this story partially to caution people to always be aware of their surroundings, especially when camping or while out in areas of parks you might assume are safe due to high human traffic. Nature was here first, and you should always respect that. That said, I'd also like to state, attacks like mine are not common, and my story should in no way make you avoid the beauty and majesty of the many beautiful parks around our wonderful nation. So, if you take anything from my story, it should be this. Just be aware of your surroundings and be safe, and you'll be just fine. Also, go outside every now and again and enjoy the nature. Too many people nowadays are glued to their phones and are unaware of the beautiful world around them. I'd like to start my story by saying I will not be using my real name. You can call me Tally. I've been working as a park ranger for about 10 years now. My story takes place in an area that has been featured on television quite a few times and is known for certain legends and hauntings. That place is Great Smoky Mountains National Park. One of the legends around here is about a witch called Spearfinger, who would disguise herself as an older woman and snatch up children, eventually cutting out their lives with her obsidian stone finger, hence the name Spearfinger. My story isn't about a witch though, and it isn't a legend. My story begins at the start of a shift one day in August of 2013. I was doing a trash check and general cleanup run just after clocking in. The air was cool, probably around the mid-60s, and things were fairly relaxed. I could hear the sounds of nature, and off in the distance, I could hear hikers wandering on one of our trails. It was around this time I noticed quite a bit of trash piled up on top of a small hill. I headed up and found what looked like a camp. It was clearly no longer in use, and whoever had been here had left it trashed. It was basically just an old, tattered sleeping bag and a bunch of beer bottles. It looked like it was probably either a very messy camper or a homeless person. The park is a 24/7, 365-day-a-year park, so it isn't unusual to find someone out here who may be homeless from time to time. Anyway, as I'm cleaning up, I catch something out of the corner of my eye. I look up to see a little girl. She is blonde, has blue eyes, and looks as real to me as someone might look standing next to you. Finding it odd that a little girl was out here wandering the park alone, I call out to her, asking her if she's okay. She doesn't say anything, and so I asked her if her parents are nearby. She stares at me for a moment, and then turns and walks away just out of sight. I stop everything and head toward the area I just saw her. It is when I head over there that I see her wandering near a group of trees. The girl seems to be humming and dancing in the middle of the trees. I call out to her again, and she doesn't seem responsive. Confused, I head down to her, but as I get closer, she ran and sprinted deeper into the forest. Beginning to worry, I follow her. As I reached where I believed she would be, I found nothing. I then heard humming, and looked up to see this little girl again. Strangely, she was once again on the horizon, so to speak. I didn't want to scare her, and asked her again what she was doing out here all alone. I asked her where her parents were, and she looked at me, but she never answered. I didn't approach the girl any further as I didn't want to scare her away. Instead, I tried to radio the main station. I had found this little girl and was hoping that somebody could help me out. Strangely though, my radio wasn't working. I asked the little girl if she was alone, but she never said a word. After a minute or two, I tried to follow her again, but she ran away. I followed this little girl off and on for what seemed like hours until I saw her at the edge of a steep drop-off. I approached the girl slowly, informing her I was here to help. I asked her to come closer. She just stared at me. I was about to ask where her parents were once more when I reached her. I held my arms out and looked her in the eye before telling her, "Sweetie, I'm going to help you find your parents. It's okay." She smiled and ran toward me. I was getting ready to hug this literal girl and carry her to safety when I felt the oddest sensation. It felt like a cold chill ran straight through me. It was at this moment I realized this little girl had walked right through me. I turned around in shock and not sure what to say when I saw her smile disappear before my eyes. I want to make it very clear as a park ranger I don't do drugs. I hadn't been drinking and I wasn't sick or delirious. I had followed this little girl deep into the forest, hoping to find her parents and get her to safety, but instead I was left with the oddest experience I had ever had in my life. I didn't bother reporting the little girl, but I did search the area after she disappeared just in case. There didn't seem to be anyone missing, and there was no children missing either. I looked in multiple time frames as well, and I just couldn't find anything. It was just an odd encounter, and one I'll never truly be able to explain. I'm sure there are going to be those who doubt my story, but I know what I saw and I still remember it like it happened yesterday. Seeing what I can only guess was a ghost was odd enough, but seeing one in broad daylight, I didn't think that happened. There is a story around these parts about a man who was murdered while searching for his missing daughter, but I never saw a man, and he is said to appear to hikers as a bright light. I'm also not so sure what his daughter is supposed to look like, and I don't believe the ghost girl I saw has any relation or real connection to the legend itself. Anyway, I appreciate you sharing my story, and anyone who hears this, have you all ever had anything similar happen to you in your life? I'm a park ranger who has been with park services at Rocky Mountain National Park for most of my adult life. It was my first job and I never really looked back after that. We are open all year and as such I work in other parks from fall through spring every year. This happened during the month of June back in the mid-90s. I haven't shared it with anyone prior to now as being a park ranger. I didn't want people to think less of me for the situation. It also, for these concerns, that I won't be sharing my name. Anyway, I went camping while off duty one late night on Wednesday. I was familiar with a lot of woods, but I wasn't completely comfortable as there were plenty of areas I'd never been on account of the fact the park is a decent size. Like most campers, I think the idea of camping, especially alone, dictates I get out of the way and away from as many people as possible. It gives you that nice feeling of just you and nature. I knew going into this that there was a chance that it would be raining that night, so I came prepared with a tent. The night was nice and I found myself a spot out of the way of most of the everyday tourist type of campers. I packed light overall and basically had my backpack with a tent, some food, and that's all I needed for the night, as I didn't plan on spending my entire time out there. It was while I was eating dinner. I'm not sure what time it was, as I didn't really pay attention to the time while camping, that I heard a strange cry coming from deeper in the woods. I was a little weirded out, but I didn't feel afraid. There were all sorts of things out here and you never knew what you might find off the beaten path, so to speak. I ignored the sound and continued eating my beans. It wasn't long before it started raining. I put out my fire and went inside my tent thinking it'd be okay and relaxing under the rain would be a good way to sleep. It was for a short while. This was until sometime in the night when I heard what I was certain was the sound of a bear looking around my camp. Startled awake by the sudden roar, I watched through my tent as the bear rummaged around, sniffing for food. Freaked out and not wanting to become a meal myself, I stayed as still as possible and grabbed my .44 Magnum I kept on my person and aimed it toward the bear just in case. I waited for what felt like forever for this thing to move on, but after a time, it seemed to sit still and stay in place. Thinking I'm screwed and going to have to kill this bear to get out, I readied my weapon, terrified at the possible consequences of what would happen. If I somehow didn't kill the bear after the first shot, I was readying myself to kill the bear when that loud, odd sound I heard from deeper in the forest before rang out again, but this time much closer. I watched as this bear stood up and seemed to whimper before running off in the opposite direction. I was hit with two feelings at this point. One was elation as the bear was no longer a problem, but very soon after that, I was hit with terror at the thought of that something was out there that had scared a bear away. I heard heavy footsteps, and the ground shook slightly as whatever was out there walked around. It wasn't until it turned away and walked back in the opposite direction of the forest that I got the courage to get up and see what was out there. It was then I began to shake. I saw a creature that was at least 9 to 10 feet tall walking off in the distance. Part of me thought about following this thing, but I thought better of it and decided instead to turn tail and pack my stuff up and get the heck out of Dodge. I eventually made it back to my truck and went home. Later research has me believing now that what I saw that night was a Bigfoot. At least, maybe I got a glimpse of one. I only saw it from the back and didn't dare chase it. I don't know how many things can scare off a bear. This thing seemed to do it effortlessly and immediately. I'm not saying I was ever in danger, but I don't think it would have been wise to try and follow it. If anything, I'm inclined to believe that the thing saved my life potentially. I don't know that I'd be here today if it hadn't shown up. Any number of things could have happened if that bear had attacked me. I could have missed my shot and gotten mauled to death. I could have hit the bear and still gotten mauled to death. My point is, I don't feel my likelihood of survival would have been high had that bear started rummaging in my tent. Needless to say, I'm much more careful now and tend to camp in more populated areas. I never talked to anyone at my job about my experience, as I didn't want to damage my reputation or be labeled as that crazy guy that spins tall tales at work. At any rate, I now believe in things like Bigfoot, but I don't think they mean us harm. In fact, I'm more inclined to believe they might be curious or just wish to be left alone. Regardless of what they may be or their intentions, I'm grateful to the one that showed up that night. I'm likely still here today because of it. A little background information. I'm 35 now, but at the time of my story I was 28 and I was going through a tough time in my life. I was going through a divorce and in a custody battle for my kid. I worked in Saguaro National Park, and when the following events happened, I was almost through my shift and was getting ready to head home when I heard something crying. The crying sounded like a dog, and being the animal lover I am, I didn't have it in me just to ignore the howling. The howling seemed to be coming off in the distance. Out here it gets very hot very quickly, and it is always wise to have plenty of water on hand. Seeing as the crying was coming from off the path and in a more deserted area, I grabbed my water bottle and headed off in that direction. Every time I thought I was about to find the dog, I realized the howling was coming from further away. My first thought was the dog must be moving. It didn't seem too far-fetched, but then I thought if it was moving while hurting, how fast could it really be going? Eventually, I did find the dog. At this point, I had been searching for far longer than I had intended, and while looking around, I realized I had lost my way a bit. Trying to focus on the dog for the moment, I examined it closely. It appeared dehydrated, and it didn't seem well fed. This dog looked to be domesticated, and that's when it hit me that someone must have dumped their dog out here. I was livid at the realization, and as I examined the dog more closely, I noticed it was barely breathing. I tried to give the dog some water, but it didn't seem to even consciously notice I was there. I was getting hot at this point and drank a little water myself, as I had to conserve some, since I'd also drank a fair bit while searching for the dog. I decided I would see if I could do anything about getting myself and the dog back to safety. I carefully carried the dog and headed back to the direction I'd come from. I used what was left of the sun to guide myself back the way I came. I walked for what felt like hours and realized after time that I wasn't entirely sure I'd gone back the right way. Alone with a dog likely close to death and running low on water, I decided to push on anyway. My hope was that I was just tired and it was making me walk more slowly and making the trip seem longer. My hope was that I was on the right path. As I continued to carry the dog, I noticed someone had music in the distance. It sounded like drums and chanting. I can't explain why, but at the time something told me that I should head the direction of the music. The music was a bit off in the direction as I was heading, but my thought at the time was that there was music, there was likely civilization, so even if I had somehow gotten turned around, I could at least be sure I was heading towards some sort of safety. After much walking, I heard a whimper from the dog. I wanted to set the poor thing down, but I was running out of water and wasn't sure if the dog would have a chance if I didn't keep going. I ultimately decided to try to give the dog the last of my water. It didn't seem to want to drink, so I tried to spread what I could all over its fur. I was honestly running out of options at this point and wasn't sure of myself for what I should do if I was lost much longer. It was then I noticed the music had become louder. I followed this music further, and as I did, it grew louder and more forceful in its pacing. Eventually, I was sure that I'd find someone over the horizon as the music was getting very loud. I was sure at this point I wasn't just delirious, as I was hearing this music clearly as someone who might be listening to music in a car would. After what seemed an agonizingly unending amount of walking, I reached the horizon and crested over a small hill. It was then the music stopped. Before me lay a path, a familiar path. I was back where I had started, and my cart I had ridden on was right there, unattended. I don't have a music-capable radio on the thing. There was no one inside of me. I set the dog gently in the back of the cart and drove back slowly to the station. When I got there, I explained to my boss, who had waited up because he was worried about me. He wanted to know why I was so late getting back. He said he was close to calling a search, but understood why I did what I did and was quite happy to see I was going to be okay. After asking if I needed medical attention, I explained I just needed some time to rest and some water, and I showed him the dog. We got animal services out there, and with much time, care, and attention, they were able to nurse the dog back to health. The dog is now happy, healthy husky that I named Chance. I have adopted it and it lives with me now. I'm grateful to be alive today and to have Chance. I unfortunately lost my custody battle and am now divorced. That said, that difficult circumstance aside, I'm quite happy today. I've recently begun dating someone for a little over a year now, and I hope someday to start over again. Chance is a super happy dog, and I'm grateful for every day that I get on this earth. The thing is, I wouldn't have been alive likely had I continued the path I was initially following. I'm not sure where the music I was hearing came from or why it stopped the moment I found my way back, but I am grateful because of this mysterious sound. I was able to find my way back. Has anyone ever had something like this happen to them? I am seriously curious as I don't know how to explain it and it still is a mystery to me today. Perhaps I got so delusional from the heat and just got lucky. I'm not saying that's not a possibility, but it all sounded so real to me. I have no real explanation for it to this day. Still, I'm quite sure I'm alive because of it. In all my years as a park ranger, I've always found it to be a very rewarding experience. There is no better job in the world in my opinion. That said, there's a darkness to this job too. Sometimes, people will use our lovely national parks as their last stop. There are a few things as mortifying as finding someone's loved one lifeless. It's a sad reality of life, and we try to let people know where they can find help, if need be, for thoughts and feelings that lead them to want to take their own lives. I've worked all around our wonderful nation, but the following story takes place in the forests of Washington. We'd recently had someone take their life, and after holding several community events, I volunteered to do some work off the clock. It wasn't required, but I decided I'd patrol the parks at night and keep a lookout. I felt it a bit of a personal watch to have as I'd lost one of my own family members to suicide. Well, the first night of my patrol, everything was quiet and calm and relaxing. I could hear the beauty of nature out and about. The air was nice and cool. Now, I'd do these watches where and when I could, and I usually had one or two other rangers who would swap out with me. Everything was calm until the third watch. It was then that things took an odd turn. I was patrolling, radio on me, as you can never be too safe when it was starting to go haywire. At first, I thought it was some sort of interference, as it was giving out a loud static sound. Then, I heard someone on the other end. They were crying, and so I tried to radio back, asking them who they were, where they were, and if they were okay. The sound of crying continued, and was soon followed by noises I couldn't explain, before my radio suddenly died. This was strange, as I keep my radio charged, and I had only just left the station with my fully charged radio before this happened. A bad battery perhaps, I thought to myself, as I headed back to the station and plugged the battery into the charger, before swapping it with another one. I was about to head out, when something came over the main radio. The truly strange part was the radio adjusted its own frequency and channel. That's when I heard from the main radio the same crying. As I was about to respond, a strange, warped tone came through the channel. That's when I heard from the main radio that something unintelligible was coming over it. At the same time, the same unintelligible speaking came on my portable radio. I hadn't even turned it on yet. This was quickly followed by a high-pitched sound, and then everything went dead. The battery on my radio wasn't working, and all the others were showing drained and recharging. I checked the main radio, and was getting nothing. I thought we'd lost power, and so I went to check the fuse box. Everything suddenly came back too, and there was a loud screaming from the main radio. It sounded like a woman in distress. I tried to radio back, but nothing happened. There was then a disturbing humming. It was like many voices all humming at once. After that, there was only static. I tried to radio out, to make phone calls. I could do nothing. The remainder of the night I spent patrolling and keeping a close eye on things. It was around 4 in the morning when the static stopped on the radio, and everything went back to normal in the station. I put my battery on the charge and then decided I'd stay the remainder of the night in the station itself. While patrolling, earlier in the night, I couldn't shake this sound. I guess the best way to describe it would be a low moaning, but I'm not even sure that would do it justice. The final 2 hours of my watch ended and I headed home. As I headed home, I swear for a second I saw a woman in tattered clothing and bleeding, walking along the road. That said, I blinked, and she wasn't there anymore. She had short blonde hair, and looked to be in her 20s. Maybe, it's hard to say. She stood about 5'2" from the glimpse I got. Figuring I needed rest, I pulled over, scanned the area for a bit, and once I was sure I was probably seeing things, I continued home. I went to sleep and didn't wake up again until 4 in the evening. I didn't dream, I didn't do anything. I enjoyed the rest of my time off, and my next watch wasn't until the following weekend. As I did my watch on one of my off days, I was approached by another one of our rangers who informed me she had experienced some odd things the night before. She claimed she had been hearing voices and she thought she saw someone on a tree branch leap and hang themselves. She then mentioned that she fell back in shock, and then the woman disappeared before her very eyes. She was unnerved by this, but she wanted to know if she had been the only person to notice odd things on watch. We spoke for a brief bit, and after our discussion, she calmed down, and much like myself, chalked it up to sleep deprivation, and probably something like that. The night of my 4th watch was where things got eerie, to say the least. I heard some odd voice constantly speaking in a warped tone while patrolling. My battery died, and yet I could still hear this odd warped tone. It didn't take me long to figure out that it wasn't coming from the radio anymore. I could hear it coming from within the forest itself. I slowly walked toward the sound until I was positive what I was hearing was just beyond the tree I stood at. I slowly turned the corner and saw a young man, who looked to be in his maybe 19 or 20s, bleeding on the forest floor, a knife in his throat. Shocked, I went over to help him. As I reached for the man, my hand went through his arm before he faded and the noise stopped. There was no longer a knife or anything. I heard a scream in the distance that caught my attention, and I quickly shot up, replacing my dead battery with a backup battery for my radio as I did. The crying sparked to life over my radio again. I then thought I heard someone running behind me. I turned around and then heard someone running again, once again behind me. I turned back to where I had previously been, and there was a light giggling. This soon faded, and I headed in the direction of the screaming. I wasn't sure what to think, as I wasn't sure I could explain away the strange happenings as sleep deprivation anymore. I'd become acclimated to my schedule of being up all night once a week. The things I was seeing and hearing were becoming more intense, and there was also the fact that some of the other rangers were also experiencing odd happenings while on watch. I heard another distant scream. It was very distinct. I continued heading in the direction of the sound, and as I did, it got louder. Every time I was sure I'd finally cut up to the sound, it got softer and more distant again. This continued for a while, before I reached a clearing and it stopped. All was silent now, save for the sobs of whoever was coming over the radio. I've never had a more eerie feeling in my life. I felt like I was being watched. The crying over the radio cut out, and I was left with the sound of silence. This didn't last long before I heard a strange chanting, would be the best way I can put it. I'm sorry if the descriptions seem off. It's truly difficult to put into words the things I heard. They were like audible anomalies. Turning the corner, I fell back in shock at the sight of several bodies hanging, motionless in the trees. The odd chanting continued as I stood up and walked through the bodies. When I put my flashlight upon them, they seemed translucent. I heard a loud scream and everything went quiet. The bodies hung as I heard something behind me. I turned only to see the rustling in the bushes, and nothing more. I looked back up and the bodies were gone. This didn't make sense at all, and it was only now I had a chance to realize I was shaking, and it was quite cold out. I decided to look around, but I found nothing else, and there was no one in sight. No odd hallucinations or audible cries. Nothing. I looked at my watch and I realized it was 4 in the morning, on the dot. I headed back to the station and was able to reach the station by about 5. I brewed some coffee and waited for the final hour of my watch to end. Once the other rangers began filing in, I left immediately. I would have discussed what I had seen or heard, but I was tired and confused. I didn't take long to go home. I pretty much raced there. There was no one on the road this time. I ate some breakfast and then crashed after getting home. I dreamt of the things I had seen. Most were unexplainable, and I awoke to the sound of a scream that I wasn't sure was real or still part of my dream. If you've ever been dreaming and you are half awake, you'll know what I mean. Sometimes, the last things in a dream will still resonate in the mind, as though they were happening in real life. I got up slowly and looked out my window. I then checked the time and realized it was 6 at night. The rest of the night was uneventful. Over the course of the next week of work, I talked with others, and they had some experiences similar to mine. They, in turn, shared some of their own stories. The crying was a common part of the equation. The batteries draining, the strange auditory and sometimes visual quote-unquote hallucinations were experienced by all of us. They weren't always the same ones, but they all happened. We weren't sure what to make of it, but after going and getting a few more volunteers on board for the watch, we decided from now on to do watch in pairs of 2. It just felt safer, and we now had the numbers to do so. My 5th watch was with a ranger we'll call Patty. Almost as though, on cue, night fell and the crying started up over the main radio. I told Patty I'd take a radio and several backup batteries and head out to search the area, and if she would be alright with staying on the main radio, alone. I wasn't sure if we'd be able to get through to one another with the odd happenings, but I figured it'd be best for one of us to stay at the station, and we attempted to keep contact in the meantime. I told Patty to lock the door and not to answer unless I did a specific knock, which we said ahead of time. It was going to be a simple 4-knock system, but the timing and pattern were such that it'd be distinguishable from a normal knock of which we shouldn't have gotten anyway at night. I soon headed out and searched the woods again. As I walked, I felt a chill in the air. It was a deeper chill than the simple fall air. No, it felt like a cold that followed me specifically. I grabbed my radio and asked Patty if she could hear me. She chimed through immediately with a loud and clear. As I was telling her thank you, and I was just testing the radio, I saw a shadow out of the corner of my eye. I turned and looked, but when the shadow was once again in my peripheral view, I scanned the area with my flashlight when I heard the crying again. I tried to radio Patty through it, but I just got more crying. Figures, I thought to myself. I went ahead and continued wandering the forest until I happened upon a woman. She looked almost blue in color. She wore a black hoodie, stood about 5'10", and looked like she was bleeding. She spoke to me, and I tried to record her as she spoke. She just kept repeating, "I'm sorry," over and over again. She seemed to be crying now, and reached her hand out. I reached out to touch her, but she vanished. Confused, I checked back on the recording I made on my phone. There was a static where the woman's voice should have been, and no one was even in the footage. I searched the area for any sign of someone, but I found no one. I was about to head back to the station, figuring I'd been out long enough when I heard the woman's voice over the radio. "I'm sorry," she repeated again and again. This continued as I wandered the forest. I tried to radio Patty again, but I got nothing. I was clueless as to what was going on. This didn't seem natural, and I was convinced something strange was definitely happening in the forest. I didn't wait for a second, I didn't believe it was hallucinations at all anymore. I just labeled them as such because I can't explain the things I experienced. I decided to head back to the station after a while to check on Patty. When I got back, I saw a very disheveled and paranoid-looking Patty on the radio. The door to the station was open, and she was crying. She started stammering and speaking faster than I could keep up with. Once I got her to calm down, she explained that someone knocked using the code we agreed upon, but when she opened the door, there was no one there. She then said she felt this extremely sudden and irrational sadness overtake her. She felt like something or someone had taken control of her mind. She was very erratic in responses to me, but from what I could make out, she claimed that she could hear someone whispering to her. In her mind, she couldn't quite hear what was being whispered, but When it would happen, she felt like she wanted to hurt herself. It was then that she showed me her arm. She had cut it. She said she didn't understand how or why, and she didn't remember doing it. I told her I'd spend the rest of the night in the station with her, and we'd dress her wound, and I'd follow her home to make sure she got home safely in the morning. I then gave her the next week off. I checked in with her frequently, and she said that she'll be fine, and she felt fine and things seemed alright again. She claimed she couldn't hear the whispering, and that she'd be back at work on Monday. I told her she didn't need to do watch anymore, and we'd already gotten someone else to volunteer. She seemed relieved at this, and shortly after hanging up, I began my 6th watch. I chose to do this one alone. I didn't want to chance anyone else winding up in a situation like Patty. The 6th watch was something disturbing. I kept to the station for this watch, but that didn't lessen the odd things happening. I listened to the main radio as it switched from static to strange things I couldn't understand. At this point, I had become somewhat used to the odd happenings around the park and station, so, unless I felt like my life was threatened, I wasn't easily startled by what I saw or heard. This was until I heard a familiar voice coming over the radio. It was someone apologizing much like the woman I had heard previously, but then it'd loop and play various versions of what I'd best describe as someone killing themselves. The first time it ended, in the sound of a gun going off before it looped again with, "I'm sorry." The second time it was drowning. The third time it was choking, like someone was being hanged. The fourth had the sound of a car wreck. Then it stopped and went back to static. The most disturbing part of these messages is that the voice was Patty's. I called her at that moment, and she picked up groggily, reassuring me she was fine. I talked to her for about an hour, and she assured me she felt fine and was ready to return to work still on Monday. I apologized for calling her so late, and she seemed perfectly fine with it given the nature of the odd happenings around the station. After I hung up, I heard 4 knocks at the door. It was the coded knocks Patty and I agreed on last watch. I knew there was no way Patty was at the door, as I had just gotten off the phone with her, and she was likely going back to sleep. I mustered up all the courage I had and asked who was there in a commanding voice, as that's all I could do. There was no response at first, just silence, then 4 more knocks. "Stop screwing around! Who's there?" I shouted. "I'm sorry." That was the response I got. Once again, it was Patty's voice. I didn't want to bother her again, but I did open the door to check outside. No one was there. Unnerved, the rest of the night went by in silence. The radio didn't seem to give off any odd sounds or anything. There were some strange sounds outside, but nothing I couldn't write off as an animal of some kind. I looked at my watch, and it was 4 in the morning. I made some coffee and waited for my watch to end. At 6, I headed home, and as I drove, I saw something peculiar. It was the blonde woman from a few watches back, wandering the side of the road, bloodied and in tattered clothing. I slowed the vehicle down and watched, but as the sun rose further, she seemed to fade. I shook this off as something just weird, and drove over to Patty's. I wanted to check on her one final time to make sure she was okay. She seemed happy to see me, and asked me how the watch went. I told her I was just checking in, and we had some coffee before I told her I'd see her Monday, and I went home. I crashed. The next week of work was perfectly normal work-wise. Patty was back and seemed in high spirits again. Those on watch got together and discussed how their watches had gone over lunch. Apparently things had toned down over the course of the watch. Most reported they'd noticed no odd happenings at all. Things seemed to be normal again. We were only going to do the watch, as we dubbed it, for a few weeks till things seemed normal anyway. That weekend, I was going to do the 7th and final watch with all involved together, the exception being Patty for obvious reasons. The 7th watch came and went completely uneventfully. There were no odd happenings over the radio, and nothing was off. Nobody saw anything in the station or in the woods. Everything was actually kind of fun with the whole group being together. On the way home, I saw the blonde woman and stopped my truck and asked if she was okay. She looked at me and waved before disappearing. I wasn't sure what to make of this. The thought occurred to me that maybe she was a ghost. I thought this jokingly, and all seemed well until Sunday morning. A day or so after the final watch that I got a phone call letting me know Patty was found dead in her home of an apparent painkiller overdose. The only thing police found that would give any reason at all as to why she did what she did was a note that read, "I'm sorry." I and our entire community was shaken by Patty's passing. We scrounged together a fund to pay for her funeral so her family wouldn't have to. We also started a community outreach program through our service to help those who are having suicidal thoughts or simply need help. I don't know how to explain the odd happenings on the watch, but it pains me to realize we lost one of our own to something as horrific as a suicide. We still do the watch, but not as often. I have heard strange things since, but nothing to the level of the initial watches. I haven't seen the blonde woman on the road since Patty's passing. I don't know how many of y'all actually believe in demons or the supernatural, but I was a skeptic for most of my life, including my time as a park ranger. That is until the summer of 2013 when I had the oddest experience I've ever had in my lifetime, even until this day. For the purposes of the story, you can call me Hank. I work as a state park ranger in Alabama. I've been doing this job for 14 years now, and I've seen every manner of wildlife you can imagine. The things I'm going to describe are strange, to say the least. I know how crazy they're going to sound, but I assure you, I saw what I saw. Anyway, I started my shift like any other. I did some cleaning, made some repairs, and had a chat with some of the locals. Growing up, I always loved nature, so it was natural that I got a job as a park ranger. If you love nature, it's the greatest job you can get. After lunch, I headed out to the patrol area and watched the wildlife. It was while walking, I heard something behind me. I turned around and I saw a dog. Now, you're probably telling yourself right now, "Aw, that's sweet, a doggy." You're probably mentally petting the dog right now, right? Well, trust me, you wouldn't want to pet this thing. It looked a lot like a Doberman, but its fur was all black. This dog sat on all fours and was my height. Keep in mind, I'm 6'2". I remember being weirded out, but thinking, okay, someone lost their dog. A really big dog. The thing is, though, I couldn't see anyone nearby. The vibes this dog gave off were just downright creepy. It wasn't just its unnatural height, but there was an almost dread that hung in the air around it. I slowly approached the dog anyway, in the hopes that I could find its owner or help it out. Despite my off feelings about this dog, it's an animal, and I'm an animal lover at heart. As I approached the dog, it got up and ran off. The dog moved quickly, and I was just unable to keep up with it. I reported seeing this dog to a few other rangers, and they said they'd keep an eye out. The remainder of my shift was pretty relaxed. A few weeks go by, and while I'm on another patrol, I see the dog again. It's a bit off far away in the distance, and it's just sitting on all fours staring. It wasn't staring at me per se, but more like it was overlooking the park itself. I was curious and radioed out that I'd spotted the dog again. The second I radioed, this dog looked in my direction. I'm not talking it quickly turned its head and looked at me. I'm talking an unusually calm, deliberate, and slow turn of the head. It stared, got up, and ran off again. I told the other rangers where its nearby whereabouts were, but they just couldn't seem to find it. We decided we'd go about our business and keep an eye out once again. The rest of the work week came and went. The next 2 weeks there was no sighting of the dog. Then, on a Tuesday morning in August, something very odd happened. I saw this dog again. It appeared to be in a hurry. I quickly ran in the direction I saw the dog move and radioed to the other rangers that I could see the dog again. It didn't take long for everyone to meet up, and just up the hill the dog sat there, its back to us, looking down at something. We rushed up the hill to look over to see someone laying on their back motionless. We immediately called the paramedics, and I rushed over to start CPR. I tried with all my might to help this person, but I believe they were just too far gone. The paramedics arrived to find a lifeless body and many of us looking sullen and distraught. I remember trying to hold back tears and repeating over and over again, I tried. I'm sure I was in a bit of a fuss, but as I was brought over to be checked out by paramedics as well, I remember someone trying to question me. It was all kind of tuned out in my head though. You know how in movies, during scenes of trauma, how sometimes people will be talking but it's like they're on mute. That's the best way I can describe it. I could see this paramedic's lips moving, but no sound was coming out. I saw something even more shocking. Up the hill, the dog stood there. Next to the dog was a woman in a black dress. My first thought was this dog had an owner after all. That's when I saw something that to this day, I can't even begin to believe happened, despite seeing it with my own eyes. The body we found was a woman currently being taken away to the morgue. It was a jogger who looked like she could be in her 30s, with blonde hair and a ponytail. I'll always remember her blue eyes as they stared at me from the hill. She looked comfortable, relaxed even. I remember staring and pointing at the hill, but no words would come out of my mouth. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't get a word out. The paramedics looked into the distance, but they didn't seem to see anything. I, however, saw the dog, the woman in black, and the jogger. I also watched them turn and walk away until I could no longer see them. I tried running up the hill. I looked high and low until I was eventually rounded up again by the police and paramedics, and I found no sign of anyone. I tried to explain what I saw when I could speak again, and I was promptly told it was likely a side effect of my shock. The thing is, though, I don't buy it. It was too real. Also, others had at least seen the dog several times before the woman's passing. I'm quite sure what I saw was real. I'm not sure how to explain it. It was easily the strangest series of events I've ever experienced in my life. I still work with the park rangers and I still love my job, and I haven't seen the dog or woman since. I'm going to call myself DeMarcus as I don't want to use my real name for this story. I was with the park rangers in Minnesota for roughly 25 years. I've seen all manners of things on the job, many odd things and many downright strange things. The story I'm about to share with you happened in 1996. This was roughly 2 years into being a park ranger for me. I'm sharing this because it was the first really odd thing I'd experienced in my career and one of the downright strangest. On a cold day in December, I saw what I can only describe as a UFO. I'm not saying it was a full-on aliens-type UFO, but something in the sky I couldn't describe. The thing had 13 lights that shined bright even in the day. They hovered in the distance and flew in unison. Just as quickly as they were there, they were suddenly gone. It was strange, but it got stranger as time went on. A few days later, someone came to our station, asking if we'd seen their son. They said he was supposed to be hiking around the area a few days prior. The day he was hiking was the same day we saw the lights. My first thought was maybe he had just gotten lost or even left and just hadn't contacted his mother. That would have likely continued to be my thought had I not stumbled upon a man matching the guy's description standing naked in the park later that night. I got the man a blanket, and while waiting for the police to arrive, I asked him if he was okay. He seemed in shock and a bit confused, which I initially thought was because he was out in the cold, naked. That said, when paramedics got there and took his temperature, he had a normal temperature. This was strange, but was even stranger was that the man had been out there for at least 4 hours when I found him. He should have been dead or at the very least freezing. During my brief conversation with the man, he kept rambling about the lights being so bright. It's all I could get out of him before the police got there with the paramedics and first responders. After the man was taken away, I never heard what happened to him after that. I looked in the paper to see if there was any mention of this situation on the news, but there was nothing. In fact, no matter how much I asked about it or searched for answers, it was as though it never happened. I talked to some of the crew about everything as well, and they seemed to think the lights were just an optical illusion and that they didn't really seem interested in discussing the matter further, so I dropped it. Near Christmas time, while working a bit past my shift doing some cleanup after clocking out, I saw the lights again. However, they were large, bright, and seemed to fly in unison. I was alone that night, and it gets dark early on the account of winter. I watched the lights for some time until they seemed to blink out of existence. It was almost like a light bulb flicker and then dying. That's what happened just before they vanished altogether. I searched the news the next day and saw nothing about these lights. I asked some coworkers of mine about them, but they didn't seem to notice anything strange the previous night while at home. Nothing happened the remainder of the year, and I eventually dropped the conversation of the lights completely. 3 years later in January, I saw the lights again, and I was positive it was them. Again, they eventually vanished. That was strange, but what was stranger was on my way home when a naked man was wandering the road. I asked him if he's okay and needed help. Strangely, he ignored me. He was muttering about the lights just as the other man had done for years prior. I called 911, and they got him to safety. Once again, once it was all over, I could find nothing about it anywhere. I was weirded out, but there was nothing I could do, so I went on about my life. I was eventually able to stop thinking about it in 2002, during the summer, when I was camping. It was about 2 in the morning when I awoke to a bright light outside my tent. I thought it was strange, so I looked out, gun in hand, and realized it was the lights again. They seemed to scan the woods and made a low humming noise. I could visibly see these lights as they were only a few feet above the trees. I was freaking out when I saw them converge around my tent. I tried to go back in, but my tent seemingly vanished. The lights circled me, and it only felt like seconds, but the next thing I remember, I awoke in the woods naked. I remember being disoriented and feeling thrown off. For the next couple of days, every time I dreamed, I'd see the lights. I saw things I don't even know how to put into words. Once I had my wits fully about me again, I went to see a doctor. I was told I was in perfect health and it was likely that I had a panic attack or some sort of anxiety-induced hallucination. I remember being very angry and being so quickly passed off as just stress. I promise you, this wasn't an anxiety-induced hallucination. This was very real. I haven't seen the light since, but every now and again I get nightmares about these things I can't explain in the light themselves. I'm not sure what happened, but I believe I could have been abducted. I know how crazy it sounds, but ever since this incident, I've strongly believed in intelligent life among the stars. I wouldn't call my story scary, and it's rather short. I would call it odder than anything. I've been with the park rangers in New York for about 5 years now. It's a great job and I love it. Every morning, however, shortly after I clock in, I usually see an older woman walking the trails, and she always smiles at me and waves. I usually speak with her while I do my rounds. I'm going to call her Doreen. Doreen is a sweet woman who brightens my day, that of anyone who works here. She's always so talkative and kind. To be honest, the world needs more people in it like Doreen. To give you an idea of how kind of a soul she was, this lady would bake bread and hand it to the homeless people and talk with them. I saw her help a dog out of a hole, and she's just got an all-around bright aura about her. Doreen was probably in her early 90s back during the time that the story takes place. Anyway, every morning like clockwork, we talk, and throughout the day, I'd see her as well. Every Friday, just before we clocked out, she would come to us with water and a story of her day. We looked forward to Doreen's stories just before we were out for the weekend, the exception being the weekend crew who would see her then as well. I remember one particular Friday evening when Doreen told us about her day. Shortly after she finished regaling us with the tales of going around town, keeping fit, and helping everyone she could find who needed help, she pulled me aside to talk to me. Normally, on a Friday, though I love my job, I'd be hightailing it to home to enjoy my weekend. That said, Doreen is so sweet. I decided to talk to her a bit, and besides, I had plenty of weekend left and wasn't in a hurry, so I clocked out and talked to her. Doreen seemed different on this day. She didn't quite seem as cheerful and seemed more worried. She told me that I needed to make sure her dog was taken care of after she passed away. She said she wanted to make arrangements for me to take care of her if that was okay. I told her it was fine and I could use a friend for my long nights alone. I also jokingly said I felt that she had plenty of years left in her as she was healthy. Doreen smiled and told me that she felt she'd been hitting the road sooner than later. I asked if something was wrong, and she then proceeded to tell me about a man she sometimes saw around her home and in her dreams at night. She said she'd been seeing the man around for years, and she believed he would be taking her on a road real soon. I made a joke about how at least she would have to make some travel arrangements, at which point she smiled and laughed at the joke before telling me she was going to miss us all. I tried to keep things light and laughed with her, explaining that I had to go, but I'd see her Monday morning. She smiled and said, I don't believe so. I'm going to be hitting the road Sunday night. I wasn't sure what to say, but since she smiled, I simply smiled and waved at her goodbye. I didn't know it at the time, but as I'm sure you've guessed it by this point, I never saw Doreen again. Late that Sunday night, I got a call that she had passed away peacefully in her sleep. She had left her dog to me in her will, which I gladly accepted, and she also left a fairly ample donation to our park services and several homeless shelters, with what was left of what she had in her bank account. We all miss Doreen greatly, but we feel more blessed that we got to know her in the time she had left on this earth. It also brings about a certain sense of peace to know she had a fair idea she wasn't going to be around, and when she passed, it was peaceful and painlessly. I won't pretend to know how to explain Doreen's visitor, but she passed when she said she would, and now I am the owner of the sweetest Siberian Husky I've ever met. Wherever you are, Doreen, I just wanted to tell you that you had an amazing impact on all of us, and we love and miss you. I won't be giving my real name or any name, and I'm sure you'll understand why shortly. I will say I worked for the park rangers for 10 years before I quit. I quit due to some strange things happening around the park that eventually made their way to my home. I felt and still feel threatened by everything that happened, so I'll only say I live somewhere in the northeastern part of the United States. To jump right into things, it all started around 2014 when doing my morning rounds. I found a deer mutilated in the park. It was a little way into the forest, and not where most of the general public would be wandering, but it was close enough by that it was a bit weird and unnerving. I reported my findings and did all the necessary paperwork associated with it. The next day I found a raccoon spliced open and hanging from the station door. Its innards were left on the doorstep. This was obviously reported as I was the first person in that morning. The fact that I was the first person in that morning was something that also bothered me. I tried to shake it off as a coincidence, but as time went on, it seems less so. 3 nights later, while off shift, I was relaxing in my former home around 10 p.m. when I heard a knock at my door. It was 3 distinct knocks, slow, methodical, and loud. I soon opened the door to see what was up only to find a bag lying at my doorstep. I freaked out and called the police as I didn't know what was in the bag, and I'm not prone to opening things left on my doorstep. I eventually did find out that in the bag was the chopped up remains of a dog. I felt sick to my stomach, and I remember vomiting soon after. It was the usual questions. Do I have anyone I consider an enemy? Is there a reason someone would leave this at your doorstep? On, and my answer was no. I had no clue why someone would do this. The police said they'd file a report and agreed to watch my place for the next couple of nights. They also gave me the number of the detective who would be working my case in the event something else came up. Something else did come up, but it wasn't at home. It was at work, in my locker. My next shift I found a note. The note had read, "Horned Figure's face," and that was it. I asked around with the other rangers and made a serious point of letting them know if someone thought this was a funny joke, they were dead wrong. That said, no one had seen anyone near my locker or claimed to have any knowledge of this. I could tell they were serious, and while I'm usually good at reading others, they left me no reason to believe they were lying. The police checked things out, and I was given the rest of the week off work. I tried to embrace this and relax. The week was paid time off, so it was basically a vacation. At least, it would have been a vacation if I wasn't so shaken up. I felt at this point, I was being targeted. The only thing that came to mind was the fact that I was the first to respond to the initial deer found. Still, would whoever was doing this know that? The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I got. I started to question my coworkers again in my head. It seemed like whoever was doing it had to have some sort of access to my whereabouts, my workplace, etc. I keep a gun in my home and I'm single, so I don't have to worry about anyone getting a hold of it besides myself. I keep it hidden, but close to me at all times. That night, or morning, depending on how you want to look at it, I woke up at 5 to 3 deliberate knocks at my door. I opened the door and found a postcard with the same symbol from the note in my locker. I called the police, and they filed another report. I was frustrated at this point, and this would only further be the case a week later, when I finally returned to work. Someone was watching me that day. I know this because as I was working, I looked up to see the symbol painted on a tree. I then looked around and saw someone wearing a red hood and a mask that had the same visible features of the symbol on the note and card. I screamed partially out of fear, but mostly out of anger, as I was getting tired of this game that was being played. I was offered more time off, but I figured that'd only give me time to worry or start getting paranoid or even angrier, and as such, I decided to keep working. I figured it was probably some messed up punks lurking around and playing games. A few days go by and I see the figure in the red hood. It's just standing there, motionless, with the same mask. I rush over and try to grab the figure in rage, and am shocked to find it's just a robe and a mask hanging from a makeshift pole like a scarecrow. Inside is another note, with the symbol on it, but this time, my name is written underneath. I called the police and they took a look at everything. The detectives that came out there were unusually quiet about the whole thing and simply took my report and almost seemed like they couldn't be bothered to do much else. It was off-putting, but so anger-inducing. I was over here, potentially being targeted, and they didn't seem like they truly cared. At least, that's the way I look at it. After this happened, I took the rest of the week and weekend off. The next Saturday night, while sleeping, I woke up to a loud, guttural screaming. I freaked out, grabbed my gun and went through my house, door by door making sure no one had gotten in. The entire time I did my search, I could hear 3 loud, deliberate knocks. They would stop, and a minute or two later they'd repeat again. I called the police, and while waiting I kept my gun close. I was furious. I wanted someone to show their face, as I wanted a reason to point and shoot whoever was harassing me, and get it over with or die trying. The police took their sweet-ass time coming, and eventually showed up at my door. To keep it short, I'll simply say they found a human head outside my door, and a card with the name of the victim and a symbol on it. Needless to say, I quit my job the next day and moved out by Monday morning. I don't want people to take me wrong when I mention my anger at the police in the town I used to live in. I realize there are plenty of great and hard-working men and women in law enforcement out there. Sadly, those in the town I lived in weren't that type. I found work elsewhere, in a different profession, and far away from where I used to live. I don't feel completely safe, but I also haven't seen any sign or hint of any sort of weird harassment where I live now. There are a lot of theories that could explain what happened or why I was targeted, but I'm not 100% sure. The best I could think is I was targeted by some kind of weird cult that is likely still out there. Why? I have no clue. I'm just glad I'm no longer living where I was. Thanks for listening to these truly odd and strange park ranger stories. These definitely are going to change your mind about wanting to be a park ranger, if I do say so myself. But maybe not. There are some strong-willed people out there. Once again, as always, thanks for watching this video, it means a ton. If you like these stories, please hit that like button as it really does help the channel reach more people. If you're new, why not subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss a new video, as I upload them almost every single day on all things natural and supernatural.